Welcome to CEVAW Conversations, a podcast by the ARC Centre of Excellence for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. Early exposure causes lasting harm. It's a finding that runs through a growing body of violence prevention research. And today, we're bringing together researchers who are mapping exactly how that works. Doan Pham is a PhD candidate at CEVAW. His research uses historical data from the Vietnam War to trace a striking pattern. Women who were exposed to intense bombing during childhood, anywhere from the womb to adolescence, were significantly more likely, decades later, to justify intimate partner violence against themselves. Revathi Krishna is a CEVAW Research Fellow based at Monash University's School of Public Health. Her longitudinal study is following young people across Fiji and Vietnam, starting before many of them have experienced intimate partner violence at all, to understand how early experiences shape vulnerability across the life course. Phil's research looks back, Revathi's looks forward, but they're tracing the same thread. We also hear from Professor Cameron Parcell from the Life Course Centre, the ARC Centre of Excellence for Children and Families over the Life Course. He helps us ask the bigger policy question that follows from all of this. If violence against women is a long-term structural problem that can begin in childhood and echo across decades, are our responses actually keeping up with what the evidence is telling us? Let's start with Phil.
So my name is Doan Pham. I'm a PhD candidate at CEVAW. And prior to the commencing PhD, I worked in the Australian community sector, like the frontline social worker, supporting women and family who experience violence and then who are mostly vulnerable. And this profession's experience shaped my academic perspective. My aim to continue to do research about this issue. And then my research focused on the violence against women in the Indo-Pacific, then across both high resource and low resource contexts. And then I examined how structural conditions and external shocks have impacts on the violence against women. And then based on the results, I can give evidence based on how policy can make the change to the situation. So I examine how institutions shape the risk and consequence of violence. And I combine policy evaluation with the data, like mostly longitudinal data. Then I can understand how system can either mitigate or reinforce vulnerability for women. Yep, I think this align directly with CEVAW's broader mission to transform structural conditions and generate evidence that leads to safer and more equitable future for women across Australia and Indo-Pacific.
So from being a frontline social worker, now you tackle the problem as a researcher in economics. Can you tell us about the work that you've been doing with CEVAW?
This is very important paper for me. The paper examines the role of the early exposure to the war on contemporary social norms accepting domestic violence, utilizing the Vietnam War over the period 1965 to 1975 as a case study. I look at the context of Vietnam because, from the figures, Vietnam currently has a very prevalent figures of domestic violence. For physical and sexual violence, for the woman exposed through their life. In the area of Southeast Asia, Vietnam ranked the second highest, just below the war average, 25%. The war is 27%. It's very significant. So that brings the ideas for me to conduct this paper. I think war is a kind of very significant shock and then can change the attitude of women. So I employed a different strategy to explore the district-level variation of bombing intensity and the cohort-level variation in the exposures of the woman as a key study about exposure from utero. From utero means the age of 0 to the adolescence, meaning throughout their childhood. And the result is very significant. The result shows that women with higher exposure to bombing during the utero to adolescent, age 0 to 19, are more likely to justify intimate partner violence over 3 decades later. And then our analysis of mechanisms suggest that lower educational attainment of the women exposed to the bombing likely drive this relationship. And by documenting this long-term effect in Vietnam, our study extends existing evidence concentrated in the sub-Saharan Africa to a different historical and cultural setting, confirming the enduring legacy of the war on the position of the harmful gender norms.
So just to make sure I've understood that, you're saying that something a girl experienced as a child in a war zone made her more likely 30 years later to accept violence against herself. Why was that age range important to the study?
Because of literatures, they called like the formative age. The literature said that experiencing from the formative age will be long-lasting consequences for human life. Yeah, not only for women, for the man, for everybody. Yeah, so based on the literatures, we bring up with the ideas to examine the impact of the war, Vietnamese war, on the woman's attitude.
And how did you identify the most impacted areas?
So from the very beginning stage of this paper, I was struggling into how to quantify the intensity of the bombing and also from the intensity of the acceptance of IPV. And because, bombing contains two aspects, which is the intensity of the bombing, which is the number of bombs dropped in the district or in the area. And the second is the length of exposures of women who exposed the bomb during the past. So how we can quantify, how we can combine together, and then we come up with literature from the literatures, and then we interact them together. So we call the variable name is war exposure intensity. Yeah, we take into account two aspects at the same time. So the length of the exposure and also the intensity of the bombing. And for the outcome variable, like the acceptance of belief intensity, which is like the acceptance woman with 5 situations whether a husband beating wife is acceptable. So from the woman data set from Vietnam, we have about more than 20,000 observations to answer the question like, is it acceptable for the woman to accept violence from the husband or partners? And then I grab the map compared to intensity, then you see the correlation. That's why we bring up to dig more into that issue, into the data set.
And you mentioned education earlier. How does that fit into your findings?
Because of intense bombing from the war, it reduced girls' schooling. War and the armed conflict may adversely affect women's experience of IPV through different channels, such as like reduce their educational attainment, resulting in their less awareness and knowledge about the issues.
We're seeing conflict affect children in so many places right now, so this work has implications well beyond Vietnam. What would you want people to take from this?
So in my first paper, it shows that like exposure to the large-scale shock like war, displacement can have both immediate and long-term effect on attitude toward violence against women. So in the context of current global crisis, the evidence can help policymakers to anticipate the risk and design early intervention program rather than waiting for violence to escalate. So the findings from my paper can demonstrate that education and social investment can moderate the impact of shocks by increasing women's capacity and agency. And this provides a clear message for policymakers. Beyond responding to violence, strengthening education and human capital is a long-term prevention strategy that builds women's resilience and bargaining power.
Phil's research is retrospective. It looks back across decades to trace the long shadow of a specific historical event. But it points forward to something important, that the conditions children grow up in and the systems that either support or fail them have consequences that can last a lifetime. That's exactly the territory Revathi Krishna is mapping out in real time. Where Phil's study measures the effects of a single catastrophic exposure, Revathi's longitudinal research is trying to capture the accumulation of everyday experiences, the things that happen in families, schools and communities that quietly shape a young person's understanding of what's normal in a relationship. She's following young people in Fiji and Vietnam over several years, tracking not just what they experience, but what protects some of them despite those experiences. Because understanding resilience, what helps some people avoid the patterns the evidence predicts, is just as important as understanding risk.
My name is Revathi. I'm a research fellow at CEVAW, which is the ARC Center of Excellence for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. I'm attached to the School of Public Health and Preventive Medicine at Monash University. And my background is clinical psych. I have a clinical psychology training and have experience doing global health, mental health specifically.
So your study's trying to track something that existing research has largely missed, which is what happens to young people before they enter adult relationships. Why does starting earlier matter so much?
It's a really good question. I think if you look at sort of what WHO has done multiple surveys to understand sort of the prevalence of violence against women. But if you dig a little deeper, you notice that oftentimes they start at adult life. They don't start earlier. So they're looking at adult women. They're primarily looking at ever partnered women. So they're looking at most of the times they're asking questions about intimate partner violence. They do ask historically, over a lifetime kind of questions where they're asking about child sexual abuse and those kinds of questions. But when you don't catch these problems earlier in life, you miss out. So you miss out on being able to prevent it. You miss out on being able to address it. Policies, all of those things change. And so I think starting earlier, getting to the problem earlier, understanding young people's experiences of violence. Sure, we're also going to have to ask throughout their lifetime, but starting earlier means there is a possibility to understand, does it shift later in life? Do young people who have difficulties in their relationships, whether it's with their peers or with their parents or with their siblings? When I say relationship difficulties, I don't mean difficulty getting along, but if they're being bullied at school or if they're having, sort of very harsh punishment at home or their siblings are bullying them, various kinds. So those kinds of things, the more we ask those questions earlier on, the more we understand the breadth and the depth of the problem. And only if we understand that can we do anything about solving it.
So the gap isn't just in what we understand, it's in who we're even asking. How did you go about building up the evidence base for this?
So our first port of call was to understand the layout of the land, to understand the evidence that's already there on the prevalence, nature, and determinants. When I say determinants, I mean both risk factors and protective factors. So you see this as both modifiable factors and non-modifiable factors that are associated with violence against women and girls. So we've done systematic reviews. What that means is you've looked for evidence in the peer-reviewed literature, and we searched for these three questions. What is the prevalence? What is the nature? So when I say nature, what types of violence are people reporting, young people and women reporting, and what are the determinants? Have the authors captured any kind of risk or protective factors? We're doing this in 3 different countries, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Fiji, the evidence gathering, I mean. And all 3 countries, the amount of evidence that was available was quite different in each of these countries. Vietnam and Indonesia, a bit more evidence compared to Fiji. And so that was our first protocol. Now that we've understood that, the next step was, what are the gaps? And this process helps you find out gaps. And we realized that most of the times prevalence and nature, all of these are talked from adulthood and oftentimes are captured in adulthood as intimate partner violence or domestic violence, and other spheres of violence, other spaces that violence occurs is not as often recorded. And young people or gender diverse people or people with disabilities and people who are single or not partnered, their experiences of violence is often neglected. And so we said we will design a longitudinal survey that follows young women and young boys, so young men, up 3 times over a period of about 5 to 6 years to understand their experiences of violence.
Revathi's systematic reviews turned up just 13 usable papers from an initial search of around 600. And what those 13 papers couldn't tell her was almost as striking as what they could. There's no national prevalence data for Fiji in the peer-reviewed literature at all. Which raises the question of what evidence is being used to create policy in this area.
It was mind-blowing. By the time we got down to the end, we got 13 papers and we were quite shocked by it. And I think the bigger thing that we were even more worried or shocked by is that there is no national prevalence data in peer-reviewed literature at all. I'm not saying national prevalence data does not exist. It does exist, but it does not exist in the peer-reviewed literature, which means other scholars and researchers are not engaging with this through more research, more work. And what that might mean is, it becomes a burden that is expected to be shouldered by NGOs and activist groups and advocacy groups. Government can write policies, but what policies work, what don't work, where is the evidence? That's where your gap is. So if there's no evidence of what might work or what might not work, policies might be based on slightly shaky ground. And if that happens, then there is no way to test interventions. There's no way to test policies. There's no way to know what outcomes should you be expecting. And then what do you measure that against? That becomes difficult. And I think that's where the problem is, that I'm not saying that everything should be on peer-reviewed literature only and grey literature is not important, but I am saying that there is a role research plays. There is a key role in testing the existing evidence, in proving what works and what doesn't work, and being able to fill that gap and inform policy. I think a colleague recently at a conference said it very nicely, where they said, if a problem is not discussed enough, it's not heard enough, then there won't be enough money invested in it, there won't be enough research on it, and then it stays invisible, which means the problem won't get solved.
So where that data does exist, is it available for research?
Good question. Oftentimes, the descriptive narrative of the data is accessible, and some data is accessible, but it's not for everyone to access. You have to get permission from whoever holds the data to be able to access parts of the data. So you can access some, you can't access some. So there's a lot of unwritten rules of where it is at and how do you get there. It's not, as you can imagine, an open source thing, which understandably, countries want to keep their data for reasons that they hold dear. It's not for everyone, but even getting to the data and then hence being able to comment on it becomes difficult.
So even getting to the starting line is complicated. So once you can start asking the questions, what are you most interested in understanding about how young people form their sense of what's normal in a relationship?
I think, like we were talking about, your first sort of blueprints of how a relationship looks like is formed by observing your parents, your siblings, how others treat you, and how others accept others treating themselves, so if that makes sense. So if there's a conflict in a relationship, how parents deal with that conflict and what happens after the conflict sort of tells the young person what they can expect later in life and what they can be okay with, or where is the boundary, what's the line, can they hit but not hit too hard, or all of these unsaid things that children just observe at home make a huge difference in what they think is okay and what is normalized in a relationship for them. It won't matter what the gender of the child is. Oftentimes we think girls might be more okay with seeing how violence is dealt out or not okay. We might have a certain stereotype about gender, but it won't matter because they're all forming blueprints of what is okay in a relationship, what's not okay, and where is the line.
Those blueprints get built through very specific kinds of experiences. What are you actually looking for?
I think we want to understand what are those modifiable and non-modifiable factors. I think that becomes a crucial element in whatever we find out, because if you want to design interventions or you want to design policies that can address them, one thing that everyone probably will agree is that no one approach fits everyone, and not one approach is going to be adequate to fix this problem. So it'll always have to be a multi-pronged approach. I think we're looking to see what kinds of factors might change over time. Because we are following up the same cohort, we get to see in the next few years, maybe in some cultures, there might be young people who might not just enter into an intimate partner relationship, but also get married or have a child. And these things change significantly. Once you have a child, things change significantly in your life, whether it's how your relationship goes as a spouse or the amount of responsibilities that you suddenly have, and keeping another life alive in addition to keeping yourself alive and so many other things, and work and financial difficulties, all of these things. So it's about understanding what are the factors that make the most difference when it comes to being able to protect someone from violence, whether that is intimate partner violence, whether that is protecting the young child from violence. Some countries do have harsher discipline. So is it a fact where is more help needed just when you have a new baby, or is more help needed for the first 2 years, or is more help needed when they become more independent and start to assert themselves and have a mind of their own? So these are the questions I think we need answers for. And not a lot of these questions have been answered. There is not clarity or acceptance. And the universal truth is there's support that is needed throughout these phases, but it's about what kinds of support and what is the best way to deliver those supports in order to minimize any kind of violence against boys or girls.
And the picture just gets more complicated when you consider that women often aren't experiencing just one form of violence from one person at one point in time.
Yes. And I'm really looking forward to understanding that myself. So it's understanding their multitude or diverse experiences. This diverse might not be the right word, but there's an idea or a concept called polyvictimization, where women are in the receiving end of violence from multiple people and multiple forms of violence over their lifetime and sometimes at the same time. And given this, I think it's important to understand where, at which points in their lives could there have been an intervention or a support, whatever we would like to call, that would have made a difference. And it's not always an intervention that addresses women, right? For example, in primary schools in Victoria, they do respectful relationships. And this is part of, getting the norm changing. This takes the longest and is the hardest because you have to start very young and keep at it till they become old and, start to have attitudes and norms of what is okay and what's not okay and those kinds of things.
So everything you've described there, the blueprints, the risk factors, the gaps in the evidence, it plays out differently depending on where you are and what the history of that place is. What does that mean for the Fiji arm of your study specifically?
There's also the added element of colonialism and the impacts of colonialism on, I guess, the entire Fijian diaspora, because Indo-Fijian peoples didn't just rock up to Fiji and said, we will settle here. There's a whole history behind it. And that came up even in the systematic review of how, women, indentured laborers, were not just exploited by the colonial sort of overseer, but also their fellow indentured men. So it was a double whammy for women. It didn't matter who the aggressor in this situation was. They were at the receiving end of it and had much less power than their male counterparts or the overseers alike. And they had to live up to expectations that the men often had. So all factors matter. This is why multi-pronged approach and being thoughtful of what's happened before matters a whole lot.
That history shapes what kind of interventions are even possible and who needs to be in the room for them to work. So when it comes to prevention, who should actually be the target?
Every step matters. Every little thing matters. We're hoping that this longitudinal research will tell us when and what would make the biggest difference at what stage of their lives and who should be also addressing these things. So it's not always about women. There's another colleague who's doing a systematic review on understanding the effectiveness of interventions in schools to prevent bullying or all kinds of violence against girls. And we saw, this was a funny thing, we saw that most of the interventions that were addressing sexual violence against girls, the intervention recipients were girls, and most of them were self-empowerment and self-defense strategies. It was effective. They were effective. Sure. We take that, but shouldn't boys be? Should there be something else here? Something's missing, and so I think it's finding those things. It's answering those questions that become important.
So, given all of that, the scale of it, the complexity of it, the history behind it, where do you find hope that any of this is actually changeable?
There is hope because a lot of countries, if you see where laws didn't exist, family violence laws didn't exist, and then were made into existence, you see a dip in domestic violence, in intimate partner violence. Whether that's a dip in reporting or whether that's a dip in prevalence is a separate question and a valid one. But there is argument that it is dip in prevalence because making something a crime and then telling people that you cannot hit your wives or you cannot beat them, punch them, whatever the law, enshrines, it does make a difference in how behaviors are carried out within, even if it's within the four walls. But that's just one example. So imagine if laws can be this powerful, what about education? What about empowering women? What about empowering men to have other outlets, to have other support systems where what if it's made acceptable to be vulnerable in front of a woman, to not have to always have to bring your A game to the table? All of these things, everything makes a difference. So I think this is where there's hope that there is in Vietnam, you see that before domestic violence law came into effect and after there was a dip in prevalence. Many studies report this. And so it's just one single law policy can make this difference. Then what would a multi-pronged approach from young age to older age, what difference could that make?
Two researchers, two methods, two very different starting points, but the same question underneath both of them. The evidence is telling us something important, that early exposure causes lasting harm, but those effects aren't inevitable. The question is whether we're willing to build responses ambitious enough to match what we're learning. Phil's research shows us that the conditions children grow up in, even extreme ones decades ago, can echo forward through a lifetime. Revathi's shows us that we're still in the early stages of understanding how that accumulation works across different cultures and life stages. And both of them point to the same conclusion, that if we want to prevent violence against women, we have to start earlier, go further, and stay longer than we currently do. This raises the question Professor Cameron Parcell puts to the centre of his work. Does the way we define a social problem determine the ambition of our solutions? I asked him whether our current responses to violence against women are built to match the scale of what the evidence is actually showing us.
My name's Cameron Parcell. I'm a Professor of Social Science at the University of Queensland and also an Australian Research Council Industry Fellow and Chief Investigator for the Life Course Centre.
Thanks, Cameron. You've written about how the way we frame a social problem shapes the solutions we're willing to fund and the ceiling we put on our own ambition. Does that framing problem show up in the gender-based violence space?
I think framing is critical when we're thinking about social problems, and framing is even more critical when we're thinking about how we want to address or perhaps even more profoundly end social problems. So some people kind of think framing is just about the spin or the discourse or the language that we use, but rather I like to propose that framing is about how we think about the problems and how we think about potential solutions. So the way we frame a problem automatically is providing opportunities for radical transformative change. And at the same time, framing can undermine our capacity to think differently about how the problem might not exist. And often in the context of homelessness and poverty and many social problems, we have a framing that not only focuses on the people experiencing the problem, but a framing that puts them as the problem. In the domestic and family violence, the gender-based violence space, this is really important because when we're framing, as we should do, the perpetrators as the problem, and an awful lot of our work with my colleague, Dr. Ella Kuskoff, is strongly advocating about the centrality of bringing the perpetrator in and framing their responsibility as core to what we need to do differently. However, when we see the perpetrators as evil, as monsters, it's very, very easy to then exclude them from what we want to do about ending gender-based domestic and family violence, for example. So we need to think about, is our framing of people enabling us to engage with them as a part of the solution, or is it excluding them because we see them as unable to be able to contribute toward the type of change that we need? So what we're trying to argue is that we need a framing that recognises who the problem is, where the problem lies and where the problem needs to change. But that framing needs to leave us open to being able to engage with those people who are the problem, who need to be central in changing themselves to address the problem. If we frame people in a way that sees them as other, as deficient, it's much harder for us to then meaningfully engage with them to ensure that their perspectives, their insights, their knowledge is central to driving the change, including the changes that they need to make themselves.
And that gap between understanding the problem and being equipped to act on it shows up even more sharply when you look at how we fund our responses.
Oh, absolutely. And in society, we're really good at responding to the problem when it's present, when it's in front of us. It's much harder to think about prevention because we don't all agree on what constitutes an ideal form of prevention. So we don't all agree on what constitutes the kind of the problems in their early stages. And of course, it's tricky because we need to think about that immediate response, the immediate response in terms of ensuring the victim survivor is safe in the immediacy, responding to the perpetrator in the immediacy, but also thinking about what can we do so that this doesn't happen in future generations. And this is much easier said than done. And it's certainly hard to advocate to invest funding in addressing an issue in a way that it's hard to identify whether that kind of intervention is going to be effective. Many people, most people would agree that violence against women needs to end. I think that's an uncontroversial position that people would agree on that. But in terms of changing patriarchy, changing societal gender norms, not all people agree on that. And they often don't see the link between that kind of systematic, structural, cultural change and the prevention of gender-based family violence later on. So that's one of the kind of the great challenges. How can we do both? And often by simply investing money in these crisis responses, which absolutely need to happen, can divert attention, can divert impetus from trying to eliminate the structural conditions that produce the need for that crisis response later on. So we need to think very, very strategically about how can we do both. And that doing both, funding the prevention to change societal conditions so that the violence doesn't happen in the future, and the immediate response requires bringing a larger cohort of society on board. It requires ensuring that people understand this kind of structural change is actually in our interests, not only so that we can live well together, but also so that women and girls can be safe.
And when those crisis responses absorb all the funding and attention, there's a cost. Not just to structural prevention, but to the sector that's expected to carry both.
Our research, along with an enormous body of research about what we might call the shadow state, is that it's both unreasonable, unsustainable to expect the community sector, even the professionalised social work, social care sector, to be able to prevent and end domestic and family violence. What we often know is that governments will enable charities or fund NGOs to provide a response, but that funding is manifestly inadequate to meet the need. But very, very importantly then, when things go wrong, when men murder women, when women are harmed by men, we often then blame the system. We blame this kind of the refuge system or the domestic family violence system or the charitable system. We're kind of looking at the problem in the wrong direction. This kind of voluntary and NGO sector is not only under-resourced and underfunded to achieve the ultimate aim of ending domestic and family violence, although it plays a critical role, but by focusing on this sector, we're ignoring where the real problem lies in terms of the perpetrator and what resources we have directed in society to ensure that the perpetrator changes, to ensure that that behaviour stops. And I think we kind of often go blaming systems in a way that makes us feel much better because we don't want to think about the real problems in society, the perpetrators and the cultural, the gender-based norms in society that foster those conditions for people to perpetrate harm against women and girls. And often the kind of the sector is the scapegoat in all of this. So what I'm suggesting is not the limited value of the sector, I think the complete opposite, but rather the way that we blame an underfunded, undervalued sector for problems that extend far beyond the capacity of this sector to do something about.
So if the sector isn't where the problem lies and crisis funding can't substitute for structural change, why haven't we built something that matches what the evidence actually demands?
Well, the honest answer from me is I don't know. I think part of the answer is because creating a society where gender-based domestic and family violence is ended requires fundamental changes to how society is organised, around gender norms, around the patriarchy, around communities, around employment, around how we think about each other. So these are kind of not changes that we can just intervene simply with kind of a new bit of funding for this scheme or a new kind of policy here. I think we can't end it because ending it would require radical transformations to society that are really, really difficult and long-term to achieve. And more importantly, not everyone agrees those kind of changes should happen. So I think the kind of changes that we really need to make to end it at kind of the structural level are so interconnected with so many different kind of things around gender, around employment, around the organisation of neighbourhoods, that it's unlikely to happen in any time soon, and it's unlikely to happen because not everyone thinks it should happen. So we're kind of not just when everyone, even though we might say everyone wants to have domestic and family violence ended, not everyone wants to achieve the kind of societal systems changes required to end it, because those systems changes are going to create what some people would see as lost opportunities for them if people see that they benefit from the current organisation of society, the current gender divisions. If people think they're benefiting from that kind of change that's needed to end domestic and family violence, they may see as being disadvantageous to themselves. I think that is the answer. So that's why we're not doing it, because of the long-term change required, because of the multifaceted types of societal change that's required, and the way that many of those changes are not agreed upon by many citizens. So I think what we need then is this kind of, what I mentioned earlier, the coming together to create the conditions where we can kind of hear opposing views, where we can understand people's opposing views, and we can work from this kind of difference of opinion, rather than kind of shouting other people down because they have a difference of opinion, trying to learn from their difference of opinion, trying to understand what is the worldviews that shape those ideas. How is it that this kind of change can disadvantage them? How is it that we can kind of collectively produce the types of changes required to eliminate domestic and family violence in a way that's going to bring people along, because they'll understand the benefits it will create for the society that they want to live in.
Three researchers, three very different entry points, but the same insistence that this problem is bigger, longer, and more structural than the responses we've built to address it. Cameron named something important. The gap between what the evidence demands and what we've actually built isn't a research problem. It's a political and a social one. And it's shaped by exactly the framing he describes. Who we see as the problem, what changes we're willing to make, and whose interests we think we're protecting when we resist making them. Phil's work and Revathi's work are part of filling that gap. But filling it fully will require more than research. Neither of Phil or Revathi's studies is finished. Revathi's longitudinal cohort has more rounds of data collection ahead, and we'll be revisiting her findings as they come in. Phil has a second paper in progress on the impact of structural and policy responses to violence against women, which is something we'll also be returning to. If you'd like to learn more about CEVAW's work across the Indo-Pacific, you can find us at CEVAW.org. And if you found this episode useful, please share it. This research only makes a difference if it reaches the people who can act on it. I'm Sian Human, and thanks for listening to CEVAW Conversations. This podcast is recorded on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and acknowledge their continuing deep connection to country. We also recognise the many diverse traditional custodians across Australia and extend our respect to all Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander and other Indigenous peoples around the world. This podcast was produced by Sian Human and Greta Robinstone for the ARC Centre of Excellence for the Elimination of Violence Against Women.